When you're fed up with fighting food and your body, join us here. I'm Allie Shapiro, creator of the Truce with Food program and your host for Insatiable, where we explore the hidden aspects of fighting our food, our weight, and our bodies, and dive deep into nutrition science and true whole health. Fair warning, this is not your parents' health care. This is a big rebel yell to those who crave meaning, hunger for truth, and whose lust for life is truly insatiable. Believe me, freedom awaits. Welcome, everybody, to Season 10, Episode 6 of Insatiable, Food Freedom number 5, and the Guilt in Downward Eating Spiral. Hope you guys are all continuing to enjoy the season. I've been loving, again, chatting with all of you, especially on Instagram. So I hope, again, today is another super helpful one. We are going to talk today about how to enjoy your favorite indulgences and end the guilt with your food so that one piece of dessert or pizza doesn't turn into, well, the day is ruined and let's keep going. It was kind of my favorite mantra. And I say that sarcastically when I was battling food because my friends in high school, actually, it was like this huge joke, diet starts tomorrow, because I would say that all the time. But back to guilt. So guilt comes from this idea that we made a wrong choice. Shame is I'm wrong. Guilt is I did the wrong thing. Doing the wrong thing sounds like I ate badly or I'm off track. And good and bad, right or wrong, isn't the only way we think about supposed wrong choices that make us feel guilty. So with exercise, it's what count and what doesn't count. It's what's natural medicine and what isn't. All of these types of binary black and white thinking and approach to life induce guilt, right? And we're setting ourselves up for guilt with this kind of thinking, because if we can be right, we can also be wrong. And so the other day, for example, I had a killer headache and I took Aleve and I felt guilty about it because Aleve isn't natural. This is the second time in my life I've taken an Aleve, so the guilt didn't last long. But when we consistently feel guilty for our food choices, we need to revise how we are defining wrong or bad with food and in our story. So this is more about chronic guilt, not an occasional, right? But we judge food and ourselves as good or bad because we are judging them from one perspective, usually internalized diet culture and patriarchy, with diet culture being a nesting doll of patriarchy, racism, and capitalism. And nesting dolls, if you're not familiar with them, if you remember those dolls, like there's a big doll and you open up and there's a smaller doll inside, and then you open up and there's a smaller doll, right? I actually think diet culture is one of the small dolls, but it's nested inside all of these other systems. So we're good if we are losing weight, bad if we aren't, good if we are working hard, bad if we are resting and thus being lazy, right? That's a very big capitalistic bucket of good and bad. So dessert is always bad or off track because it's setting us back calorically, or packaged foods are always bad because they are processed rather than understanding processed foods are on a continuum, and some processed foods are better than others. And sometimes you need them because it's better than ordering out. Truce with Food is about a neutral approach to food and life, so we can learn the value of context, nuance, and what food and life path works best for us as individuals in this gray area versus trying to conform to prepackaged ideas of good and bad. The real freedom comes from neutrality, right? In previous episodes of this season, I talked a lot about what we are eating and what we are doing in our stories. And last episode, we started to get into the how. Specifically, how all or nothing eating is how we think about things, not what we are thinking about. As I said in last week's episode, the how goes one step further than cognitive behavioral theory, which is shortened for CBT, because in my work, we are also focused on how we judge the outcomes of our choices, and also that food isn't usually about the food. So reframing our negative thoughts about food will only take us so far. And that's really a hallmark of CBT. For those of you not familiar with CBT or cognitive behavioral therapy, it's a form of talk therapy that helps you become aware of inaccurate or negative thinking so you can view challenging situations more clearly and respond to them in a more effective way. However, when we are judging our choices in black or white or good or bad way rather than evaluating choices more contextually, we get into trouble. So for example, eating cake for your birthday, if that's your thing, yay, celebratory. That's, I think, align with what you want to feel like, right? Eating the leftovers from that same cake in large amounts during a binge, probably not what you want to be doing. But birthday cake isn't inherently a choice to feel guilty about. Or exercise, what counts and doesn't count in terms of short-term weight loss. Long-term weight loss is a much bigger mystery. You might feel like walking your dog in nature doesn't count and thus feel guilty when in reality, this might be what your body needs that day, especially if you are in the later phase of your menstrual cycle. When we can be in the middle and replace judgment with discernment with any choice, food or the ones in our story, we can end the guilt around food because we realize no choice is wrong or permanent destiny. Rather, it's all research to learn how to further align ourselves with our values. And alignment is a process, not a thing. So there's lots of room to experiment and succeed. So today we are going to talk about how we can eat so we don't feel guilty about our favorite treats and how we are in our story that keeps us feeling guilty. For me with my food, it was a revelation to realize that I could be moderate with desserts and still keep my depression away, my skin clear, and not gain weight. In other words, I didn't have to be what I thought of as totally good to get results. I wasn't able to see this at first because I wasn't able to be moderate. I was missing so much big information in my inability to be moderate. I just felt guilty when I ate the desserts I really wanted instead of the healthy desserts, what I thought was healthy at the time, like Weight Watchers desserts that were 2 points, but if I'm honest, they were kind of gross. Oh, especially their bars. Again, I don't know if they're still making food, but I remember how chemically they tasted, but I was like, oh, I'm being good. But they weren't really satisfying, in my opinion. Nor did I realize my emotional health was just as important as what I was eating and my ability to be moderate. And my emotional health included expanding what my ideas of good were, which I'll get to in the second half of today's episode. For starters, I first needed to tune into when I really wanted dessert or salty carbs like chips, pretzels, and pizzas, and when I was eating because of my story. This enabled me to see that about 80% of the time, I wanted to eat because of my story. I didn't love food as much as I thought I did. But what would happen, and happens with a lot of my clients, is going on automatic pilot of my own off and on day food rules. On was eating perfectly, avoiding junk food, and going to the gym. Off was anything that strayed from my plan, skipping the gym, or having a binge that seemed to come out of nowhere. As a few clients have described feeling on track, it's like a balance beam they feel like they could fall off at any moment. What they are saying here is their ideas of good are so narrow and bad is so vast. The kind of food freedom worth working towards rests on dissolving the track that there is an on or off day or good and bad foods. There's 2 eating keys to help you start to dissolve on and off or good and bad thinking, which is code for I made the right or wrong choice, hence the guilt, right? First, it's important to recognize what often causes the downward spiral is telling ourselves that what's the point, we are going to keep going. Because in the past, we did do this, or we decide after a stressful workday, we are going to stop at the grocery store and go to the bulk food section and get the chocolate-covered almonds. Or peanut M&Ms is probably what I would have chosen. In other words, we're deciding how we're going to eat based on the intensity of our emotions at the moment. We can begin to prevent this downward spiral by not deciding how we are going to eat in the future ahead of time. Because when we are battling food, part of how we react is quickly and automatically to make a judgment, including that we made the wrong choice and are, quote, bad. Part of how you can slow down your spiral on guilt is not deciding ahead of time how you will eat for the rest of the day or week. You can totally not go to the gym tonight because you are too tired. And how about checking in with how you feel after work and seeing if you do want to maybe do some restorative yoga to release a lot of the tension from the day. You can have dessert after dinner. And how about you check in with yourself for a few nights to see what else you might want or need. What we are doing here is slowing down and getting present to what is instead of our predetermined thinking. We are actually sinking into how we are feeling. And by tuning into what we need or want to choose later on, when we actually do get home, for example, we start to become more aware and clear on our needs and how they change. For example, you may be exhausted because it's the week of your period, and so you tune in and decide you need a nap. You take a nap and afterwards you feel like a light walk. And then the next week, with your energy up because it's the start of your cycle, you tune in and you feel like going to the gym and doing hip hop. I mean, I like hip hop. Zumba, I know a lot of clients love Zumba, but I'm more of a hip hop person. So these examples are what I would want to do. But the more we can connect being in this gray area to align choices for how we want to feel and what we need, because sometimes what we need, yeah, and what we need, I'm not going to go on that tangent, the more we end up learning what will help us with consistency. And pro tip, get more specific beyond, I want to feel good. What does that mean? Do you want to feel rested, focused? When we are unclear, we fall back on diet culture metrics. And those metrics may work for the short term weight loss, but I don't know many people who have that as a goal, since we know that that causes long term weight gain. The research shows that dieting for short term weight loss is one of the biggest causes of weight gain. And we talked about why in episode 2 of this season. So go back and listen to that if you hadn't heard that before or why that happens. So rather than judging the day already, it's about tuning into what your body needs, because the body is subtle and our stories are loud. The other key is understanding how to eat around foods that can trigger a downward eating spiral. Eating in a blood sugar balancing way can go a long way in supporting you to not feel guilty, simply because it helps you to be moderate. And when our blood sugar is on a roller coaster, we lose emotional capacity. In the diabetes journal, and again, well, we all need to pay attention to blood sugar. If you haven't gotten anything from this season, I hope it's that not only diabetics need to pay attention to blood sugar. I've been saying that for, I think, like 13 years now, and I'm going to probably be saying it for the next 13. In the diabetes journal, however, there was a fascinating study that showed high levels of blood glucose, aka blood sugar, compromises our ability to process emotions, right? We've been talking a lot about this physical and psychological feedback loop as infinity. And I think this study shows this so well on a very zoomed in lens. And also the CARE journal found that people with type 2 diabetes reported increased feelings of sadness and anxiety during acute hyperglycemia, which is again, elevated blood sugar. And this is what happens to all of us when we eat processed carbs. With type 2 diabetics, it's usually more chronic and the peaks and valleys can be more dramatic. Type 1 diabetes is, autoimmune. It also happens to exist on the same gene as celiac disease. That's something else, but type 1 and type 2 diabetes are different. So in other words, the same way life feels different on 4 hours of sleep versus 8, it also feels different on high or low versus regulated blood sugar. So how we eat determines how we will feel about things, including feeling overly sad or anxious about the same experience. So in essence, we can look at the same exact life experience and we're going to feel very differently about it based on our blood sugar. Here's a handy rule of thumb I give to clients that is really helpful to start when they are first understanding blood sugar control in an everyday way and how to better balance their meals. And it's important that if we're going to eat foods like desserts or like salty carbs, like pretzels or whatnot, that we eat them with our blood sugar balanced so we don't spiral. And again, this is a general rule of thumb. This isn't going to apply all the time, but it's a great way when you're first trying to start to understand context and what works for you, probably what will help you. But the more that you move on in your path, the more nuanced and complex you see everyone's blood sugar is. But here's how to first get balanced. If you feel tired after a meal or when you want a snack, you probably need more complex carbs at your meals, like a fruit or sweet potato. When people try to go no or low carb, it often backfires. So many clients start to discover as they get clear on their physical needs and story, they're often turning to food because of being tired. So rather than assuming you always need food, they often discover they need a walk in the sunlight or a nap or to get to bed early. And this is what I mean about the power of checking in and asking what we need and waiting for an answer before telling your body what you will be doing. If you still feel hungry after a meal or when you want a snack, you probably needed more protein at the previous meal. And you should definitely get protein in your snack. If you're a parasympathetic dominant or equally balanced nervous system wise, you probably need animal protein to quench the hunger, like a hard-boiled egg or something. Those are usually easy to find on the go. And again, episode 2 can help you to know a starting place of how your nervous system influences what you eat. And then if you're craving something sweet or salty carbs, you probably didn't get enough fat at the meal before. So it's important to get some fat so you don't further destabilize your blood sugar with sweet or salty treats. I always think nut butters are great for this. I know if I, because I was out, or not that I'm out that much these days, but one of my go-to snacks is always like peanut butter with half an apple. That always is great. Often these imbalances, tired, hunger, or cravings, are judged as bad or wrong when really the body is trying to get our attention. If we don't pay attention and already judge that we've eaten too much or this amount of carbs is so bad, recognize that this is more about your ideas of good and bad. And if you can connect these new choices to feeling better, you will expand your ideas of healthy. And the healthier we get, we will have to expand our definition of healthy, because I'll share in my own example, even not caring at all about what I ate was good for me during my healing journey. Yeah, it's really matrixy healing. Even all my failed weight loss attempts brought me to my path. Of course, I wish I would have had a better map and a different narrative, which is why creating what I wish I had is so fulfilling. But once you go into eating your salty or sweet indulgences balanced, you will realize there is so much more nuance about how much nuance there is. Like, there were certain desserts I thought I loved, but the more balanced I became, they would give me a headache. Or the more I added in whole real flavor to my diet from Whole Foods, the less super sweet desserts I could tolerate. And again, I never thought I would say that in my life. And a lot of my clients are flabbergasted that the same thing happens to them. Or learning that maple syrup and honey didn't send my blood sugar into a tailspin, but regular sugar did. So even categories of natural sweeteners weren't accurate for if they worked with my body. Like, I learned if I ordered ice cream with real sugar, the fat in it didn't make me crash the way low-fat frozen yogurt with sprinkles did, because there's actually less sugar in ice cream and more fat, and low-fat frozen yogurt is pretty much all sugar. Or even how eating dessert at night made life easier for me than eating sweets earlier in the day, because I was going to bed rather than having to rebalance my blood sugar during the day when I'd crash and not be able to nap, so would need more carbs to make up for the crashing. So on a food level, you need to slow down your automatic eating plans. Give yourself the gift of deciding in the moment. And in that moment, ask yourself the simple question, what do I need? And also wait for a response. Sometimes the first draft of your intuition isn't our intuition, but what's most well-worn in our mind. The more time you give yourself, the more new answers will come. It's like turning on a hose after a long winter. Lots of rust will come out. That's what's been stored up. I use the hose and winter metaphor with clients. First turn it on in spring, again, a bunch of rust. But if you wait a bit, you get clear water. And same with our intuition. And again, episode 4 of this season about redefined self-acceptance will help you understand why it's often hard to hear our intuitive eating signals. The first couple of times, or maybe even weeks you do this, you still might want the food as a way to balance out restriction. You might not. Be curious and make life easier for yourself by balancing your blood sugar, including with desserts that won't decrease your emotional resilience. Experiment with my rule of thumb to potentially shift some ideas of what a good amount of fat or carbs are. This can help us work through our stories more calmly, because how we are in our stories is quite the opposite. And we will get into that after a word from our sponsor. Do you want to get to the root cause of why you fight food and struggle with your weight? Do you want to figure out what foods work best for you and rewrite the story that causes you to fall off track with your eating? Do you want to feel in control of food with more freedom and fewer rules? If so, my annual flagship Truce with Food program is tailor-made for you. In this boutique, small group experience, you have the best of both worlds. My individualized attention and the accelerated learning curve that comes from growing and learning with others, so you can put yourself on a track to a sustainable, healthy weight for you. To learn more, including hearing client stories and why they consider this program life-saving and life-changing, visit alishapiro.com/trucewithfood. And for our 2020 group, use the coupon code EARLYBIRD to save $500 if you register by Monday, February 17th. Registration opens Monday, February 10th. Hope to see as many insatiable listeners there. Okay, so how are we in our stories? Part of the guilt is how we are making meaning in that moment. First, it's important to clarify the difference between the how and traditional emotional eating techniques, which tells you to feel your feelings. The how is a vitally important part of ending our food battle, and it's different than traditional emotional eating advice. Traditional emotional eating advice will tell you to feel your feelings. This is certainly a part of it. And I see the fact go around that an emotion only takes 90 seconds. And if you can be with that emotion for 90 seconds, your emotional eating will go down or disappear. This can be true. And the whole truth is that if your emotion contains a story, which is what a feeling actually is, so these feelings are actually chronic and are hanging over our heads. So we feel food and our weight controls us. So emotions only last 90 seconds if they aren't attached to a story. If they are attached to a story, it's going to feel chronic. So think about if you're feeling sad, you might feel better after a workout. It was a temporary state. Those are often the feelings that traditional emotional eating will talk about, right? If you're lonely, call a friend. But if you're feeling fat or addicted to sugar, these are more chronic states, right? Fat isn't a feeling. Rather, it's a story about what we believe is good or bad based on our weight. Or addicted to sugar is something we believe so much about ourselves that it becomes an identity. This is why I address stories, because these chronic feelings are how we feel about food and weight feels all-consuming because it's part of our identity and what we think of as good or bad. Dr. Antonio Damasio describes how we feel about things like this as background feelings, which he postulates affects us more than those waves of feelings that emotional eating journals ask us to capture. I agree with him, hence why I cite his research. These background feelings are more chronic and so harder to grasp because they've been normalized for as long as we've been conscious of our weight. This is the on a track, off a track balance beam we could fall off at any moment. This is how we feel about food, not specifically what we are feeling that drives us to eat. The balance beam feeling is also how we feel about other areas of our life where we've historically struggled too, or areas where we haven't had immediate success, practice, or a lot of what feels like bad luck, like dating or finances. And a key residue of trauma, which birthed our stories, is being all or nothing or black and white or rigid ideas of good and bad. When you are under threat or there is a chronic threat to your well-being, there is no time to be discerning. All or nothing thinking protects you. The challenge now is that our stories today, the majority of the time, we aren't actually under threat, but we prepare to be. Side note, I often get asked about how we can know our stories or resources for them. And truthfully, it's really challenging because it's the water we are swimming in, right? The healing process is to see you have a story rather than the story having you or controlling you. And so often you need an expert to guide you through the process, especially so you can see the power of this. Because often when we try to do this stuff on our own, say, oh, that wasn't that powerful or whatnot. And it's often because, again, you need an expert. However, I do want to recommend the book Immunity to Change by Dr. Lisa Leahy and Dr. Robert Keegan. It's one of the foundational frameworks I adapted in Truth with Food. Their book uses organizational examples, but it's still informative and relevant to the individual. And in fact, they even open up with this stat that 1 in 7 people who have a heart attack won't be able to change their diet and lifestyle because of how powerful identities are and how we eat and take care of ourselves. They also applied their theory to conventional weight loss ideas about eating less and moving more, and wrote a book called Right Weight, Right Mind that you might want to check out as well. I don't think it goes deep enough, nor does it address the physical and food pieces to cravings and health. I mean, their theories are radical and amazing. And again, I've shared on other podcasts how Google's head of learning and development said immunity to change is, the future of coaching, which me and a lot of my female friends have been doing for about 10 years, but maybe because a guy at Google said it, it will be so. But the point is, they still are applying in Right Weight, Right Mind conventional ideas of like basically a calorie deficit rather than the current research and also how dynamic our bodies are, because our bodies aren't machines. So my point is that the book may help you. And I think there's some pieces to the book that, again, need more added to it. But again, check it out, Right Weight, Right Mind. And I will have links to both books and reviews to them on the show notes at alishapiro.com/podcast. And my reminder here too that there's transcripts available for these episodes as well there. Okay, so those are some resources for starting to identify your story by yourself. Another way to identify at the very least, hey, I'm in a story, is how we are. It's how we are feeling about something rather than what we are feeling. What we are feeling might be lonely or like a failure, but how we are feeling about that is different. We may feel like a failure or anxious around work or food because how we are feeling is the balance beam and there's no room for error. If we don't hit our routine perfectly, we lose and everything falls apart. In our mind, we're thinking it's so hard to get it right and so easy to get it wrong, or it's so much effort to lose weight and we can gain it all back with one slip. While gaining weight in our environment is much easier than losing weight, and that's more a systemic society issue than an individual issue. And while one's presentation, one deal, or one case at work may be very important, the success and failure curve isn't as dramatic as we think, including for weight gain and weight loss. For example, I've been the same weight, probably give or take a few pounds before pregnancy. I don't know what I weigh now, but for 6 years before getting pregnant, I was pretty much the same weight without paying attention to it because I know what foods work for me and I owned and healed my story that sent me off track. Whereas when I was battling food, I would say lose a few pounds in a few weeks when I was trying something new. And then 1 week of falling off track, I probably gained it all back plus a few more. But the reason it can feel it's so easy to fall off track is because we have a very tiny definition of good and everything else is bad. Hence why the balance beam imagery is very true. Think about it. You probably have a more narrow idea of what foods are good versus bad, or what exercise counts and what doesn't, or you can only date at a certain weight range, or how much time you can take for yourself before you feel selfish, or how hard you have to work to enjoy the success you want. All of these are very balance beam ways of being. Good is the balance beam and bad is everything else. And good is often based on diet culture. But diet culture is built on its fair share of junk science and advertising-friendly simplistic thinking and messaging. Corporations often fund science, and so much of it is disproven decades later after the damage has been done. Look at sugar. We had 3 Harvard scientists were tasked with redirecting the focus from sugar as fat as a culprit for health issues. One of those scientists eventually became head of the USDA, which obviously influences food guideline policies, which encouraged all these grains and low-fat foods for so long, which are the highest profit margin, with the longest shelf life and the easiest to distribute. Or we can go back even further about how medicine became standardized in the first place because of the Flexner Report, which shut down more natural medicine, which is where women, indigenous, and people of color were practicing, and wasn't scalable the way standardizing medical education can be. This may feel like a digression, but it's an important point. Our narrow ideas of good have come from systems that marginalize most people and ideas that aren't profit-seeking. From a psychological safety perspective, which is what we are seeking in our stories, it's the same deal. We have a very narrow idea of what is good to be. Usually it's some version of hardworking, responsible, productive, and quote, nice. And even those of us who identify as rebels have a quote, good way to be a rebel. Good here in America has its roots in what land-owning, white, wealthy Christian men thought was good. They constructed ideas of virginity, a good woman, even race. People used to be identified by their country because race isn't a real thing. And again, this is a tangent, yet really important. The Seeing White podcast out of Duke University. If you want to understand how America was really designed, listen to that series. You will start to understand especially how the conversations around abortion, virginity were about protecting white land-owning Christian men. It's the social studies history I wish I had gotten, but didn't in my quote unquote blue ribbon public high school in Pittsburgh in the suburbs. I'll link to that podcast series as well. But even if you aren't Christian, these constructs shape our culture today. For example, virginity isn't really a thing, but they made it one. How we define sex is truly on a continuum too. So is gender, sexual attraction, yet we were conditioned to believe we could all be put into a good and bad box. Bad is based on what we learned would put us at risk for unbelonging, based on what we learned in our families, churches, and media, which got their ideas from these big systemic structures of patriarchy, racism, and capitalism. The more marginalized you are based on sex, class, religion, and race, the less real safety you have. Okay, now that we understand it's not self-limiting beliefs that created our good and bad buckets, but rather systems, if we have enough privilege, we can choose if we want to digest these prepackaged ideas, or do we want to find out who we are organically and welcome back the quote bad parts that aren't really bad, yet left during trauma, often because what if our families or communities identified as quote good or bad, and how we internalize that ourselves. Let's zoom back in on how this affects the weight conversation. Exercise is an example of this, and where our stories often active because most of us who struggle with food also struggle with exercise. And we have rigid ideas of what counts and what doesn't count. In many ways, capitalism has helped make our exercise a thing and the frame we bring to it in the process. And our capitalistic culture can profit when something is a thing, right? Look at yoga or detoxing in the US. I mean, yoga is about simplifying and embodiment. And again, I own a yoga mat, I wear Lululemon pants, but it's kind of crazy when you really think about how we've funneled the idea of yoga into our culture. The more we make something a thing, the more it gets built up, the more consumer and profit opportunities there are for it. And the more we believe we have to literally and figuratively gear up. For instance, Goop Labs, which is on Netflix, featured being out in the cold with this Norwegian guy. And, guess what? If we dress less warmly in the winter, if we sleep with the heat off and take colder showers, we can get the daily benefits, especially if we aren't in an acute state of health issues. But on this Netflix thing made being out in the cold a thing, right? But the more we build something up, whether it's an expensive spin class that requires rigid timing and the right clothes instead of a vigorous bike ride outside, or banging away at a treadmill at a fancy gym and Lululemon running clothes, versus a restorative walk or jog outside, the more we internalize capitalistic ideas of health and wellness, and our balance beam of good gets narrower and narrower. And again, we can all enjoy these things that I've described. That's totally fine. And also realize that things count outside of these quote things. If we don't interrupt this pattern, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. We lose the advantage of all our small gains and get further away from nature, and then ultimately need more medical intervention, right? That's the self-fulfilling prophecy. For example, I firmly believe, and I could show you the science, that walking my dog in the morning to get sunlight and then making more of my workouts casual, longer walks with Coffee, who's our dog, outdoors in Frick Park, a giant forest we have here in Pittsburgh, helped me get pregnant. But the old me who was measuring diet culture metrics would have never done this. Or if I did, I would dismiss that it counted because it's free, it's simple, and I enjoyed it so much, versus it having to be so hard like those miserable 5-mile runs I used to do. A puritanical belief that is glorified in the United States, at least. Being open to this, I discovered research on how lighter exercise and moving differently can be good for conception, whereas some people may think they are being healthy and therefore optimizing their fertility with extreme exercise. So when we believe a lot to be bad and very little to be good, how we are in our story is scattered, spinning, ungrounded, basically how it feels when we are in a trauma response. We overanalyze, spin, go on automatic pilot, or feel overwhelmed. All 4 of these terms are how my clients have described their internal state of how they are in their story. Basically, they feel on guard, which is why we always feel we need to gear up. And we do this when we are on a diet, but we also do this with exercise and often unconsciously in the life areas our story is active. It's been sufficiently normalized that we often aren't even aware we are doing it. So many clients are shocked at how much more energy and calm they have even while working through their story, because they've lived so much in gearing up mode or crash mode. I had a client just the other day, she's experimenting with new ways of being in her work, and she had a really stressful work day, and she said she came home physically exhausted, but not emotionally, and therefore didn't eat. And she said, it is just so different operating from this place when you can step outside your story. And I was like, I know, it's so life-changing. So how are we when we feel like there's a balance beam of good and everything else is bad? First, we judge quickly, or close the story loop, as we say in Truce with Food. We get easily triggered to be judgmental of ourselves and others. What we eat, this is bad. I didn't get to the gym, bad. With food, we judge every food choice, meal, or every day rather than understanding trends, including what amount of desserts, if you're like me, I could have. We judge in the moment rather than over time. In our story, we judge ourselves and only see black and white choices. This is the only exercise that counts. I have to do this at work. I should do X. What's the point of trying Y? Most of our have tos, shoulds, or musts are based on prepackaged ideas of good or bad choices and behaviors. The second thing we do is react quickly. Part of why we judge so quickly is because our nervous system is involved, and it makes us feel like time is running out, or we have to do something because we feel misunderstood or don't want to be misunderstood, or we're angry, or something is very uncomfortable. We react quickly to release the tension with an action that we perceive reduces our risk. And again, here's the kicker that in present day, we often aren't at risk at all. By putting ourselves into all or nothing thinking, we can't see any other choices besides good or bad. Often, if we judge something too quickly as so hard, our reaction can be a decision of non-action, a decision to avoid. Reacting quickly isn't always or solely a time measurement, but more a matter of often, did you stay open to all the information you needed before you reacted, right? Like if I would have, again, this is just the latest example where I've been owning my story was with my fertility. If I would have taken what Western medicine told me was my only option and just been like, okay, that's what I'm doing, rather than exploring my other choices, right? I don't know if I would be pregnant today because the IVF success rates aren't as high as many people would think. So that's just, one example of me staying open to the information rather than judging quickly. The third thing we do is we supersize nutrition and life choices. With the stakes perceived as being so high, we assume with all the work to stay good, there must be immediate success or failure, love or rejection, etc. So we fantasize when we are being good and catastrophize when being bad to try and protect ourselves from all angles. Fantasizing and catastrophizing are two sides of the same coin. This includes building up what we think will happen when we lose weight or building up how much nutrition counts in our healing. My clients and I laugh because we do the work on food, and I'm totally chill about the nutrition because I know often the emotional healing is more important and the food will fall into place eventually. Whether it's food, exercise, or any one tool, it all feels more important than each tool is on their own. And the last thing we do is we have a sense of scarcity. When we have abandoned parts of ourselves to try to be good for others, we will feel not enough and we will project that onto the world. Now, first of all, our social systems have created real scarcity, and capitalism is creating genuine scarcity of fresh water, clean air, and nutritious soil. And the less economic means you have, the more scarce these natural medicines are. This is not all in your head. I can't stand when the coaching world, it's like scarcity is an idea, not a thing. No, it's very real. And part of why we have the scarcity is all of us think we need more than we really do because we are missing our wholeness. I found with myself and my clients, the more we heal, the more we want, quote, the simple things like time in nature, to be of service to others, to express ourselves creatively, and to enjoy real fresh food. The more parts of ourselves we have access to, the more resilience, creativity, and wholeness, all of our true natures or sense of home we feel. And so we don't need to fill ourselves with food or other things. An example of this is thinking there aren't enough good partners out there and all the good ones want skinny people, or only some people can do work they love. Again, based on your privilege, this is partially true. And more of us listening to podcasts can if we know the full range of how capable we are. And the neat thing about what we want most with the desire for weight loss, which is to belong and be recognized for our talents and gifts, is actually the opposite of scarcity. More belonging creates more belonging. More emotional intimacy creates more intimacy. We can really see this with newborns. The more a mother breastfeeds, the more milk the body produces. The more sleep an infants get, the more they want. Mother Nature is inherently abundant. Just look at the beauty alone she has created, right? See a couple good sunsets or a couple great views of the mountains or the beach or whatever is your thing, right? So much abundance of beauty. So there's a truth to scarcity, and the more we heal ourselves, the more abundant we will all feel. And I do believe we have to start with ourselves because the more healed we are, the more healed or integrative solutions we come up with instead of these polarizing ideas. So these 4 ways of being is how we see things when we are in our story. And without being aware of what's happening, we often create a self-fulfilling prophecy. Once we get out of our black and white story and see there's so much more room to experiment in life, the balance beam dissolves. Okay, so once we know we are experimenting, right? Experimenting reminds us that, hey, nothing's permanent. And even just remind yourself, hey, this is an experiment. Takes so much pressure off things. It's like, yeah, how can I know until I know, right? Okay, so there are 4 new ways we practice being when we are choosing differently in our story and reorienting from trying not to lose to playing to win. Again, getting what we need and want. The first thing is to evaluate with new metrics instead of judging ourselves. Most of our ideas of good and bad are based on diet culture. Western medicine's war on the body mentality, or capitalism. Funded research by companies with vested profits, interests, and thus research outcomes is just the tip of the iceberg here. When we learn to evaluate based on metrics that matter to us, mainly what we value, we find a fluid structure that works for us. Because remember, values aren't inherently bad or good, it's about alignment. When at one point I worked with an imagery therapist, Bob, to heal my trauma from childhood cancer. And again, we had him on the podcast, Fat is Not a Feeling, and I'll link to that in the show notes as well. Our work together actually led to me gaining 10 pounds over the year and a half. I was so depressed and tired, I actually stopped eating that much. I was also living by myself since my husband was at a graduate program in Iowa, and I had zero motivation to fix meal. I could also barely exercise. I just didn't care about eating and exercise. The old me would have judged my food and exercise unraveling as bad, and the new me realized that this was the work I needed to do. I needed to be with these feelings, and so that was my new metric. Could I stay with this intensity? Could I really do the work, which was going to the appointments and trusting the process? Those became my new metrics because I wanted to get to the root of my depression this time. Before, my depression had been a physical and emotional imbalance. This time it was soul level work. And I share that again because we think healing is linear. We think weight loss is going to be linear, but everything is a spiral. Everything is a spiral. And the deeper you root, the more you can rise. So once you have metrics outside of diet culture, so many more possibilities open up. In our stories, our metrics are about minimizing risk instead of what we really want. And so it's defining what we really want and then evaluating from there how to get that. The second thing to do is give yourself space. Giving ourselves space in terms of time or wave of emotion to pass, talking it through or journaling with the right questions, whatever works for you, gives you distance and the ability to respond instead of react and see new possibilities. In my work with Bob, I really got the importance of time and letting things settle to integrate in a deeper way. I knew from the issues I had healed before that my pattern was to rush things. And yet this layer of healing asked me to trust for a whole year and a half of what felt like everything unraveling. But what was really happening was I was finding and integrating the deep hidden parts of my soul. And this happens in truth with food. When we call it the muddle. As people start to own their stories, they have a similar, I don't know if I would call it an unraveling. I don't want to put words into anyone else's mouth, but we call it a snow globe. When the one identity that you have is dissolving and you haven't quite yet, cemented the new one, it feels like a snow globe. But that's what healing feels like. And I find that at each level of healing, the dark night of the soul might be a little bit longer, as metaphorically, it takes more time to be in the dark the deeper those hidden parts are. This also might not be universally true. And when we are having golden nights of the soul, when we are reclaiming the powerful parts of ourselves we have disowned to be safe in our culture, which looking back, I felt I did with my infertility diagnosis that took me about the same time to trust the process, about a whole year. Not quite as long as my time with Bob, and it definitely wasn't as intense. It wasn't that hard, except for not knowing how it would turn out. It wasn't as intense as the dark night, and yet it still involved letting time, which is a form of space, be a healing tool. It can be challenging to make sure your time is well spent and you aren't avoiding. That's why I always recommend working with someone who knows their stuff with healing. We get healthy in community and together. But you can experiment with space. And the next time you feel like you need to react to an email or a request, let it sit. See how you feel about that same email the next day. That's the power of space. It enables us to see more clearly without our emotional state or story interpreting it, right? That's why even when we look at the past, we see it differently because it has so much time and space. And we're coming at it from a different emotional state. Next, you want to right size. We have to see how we are building things up because we assume immediate success or failure, recognition or rejection. Weight loss itself doesn't grant us immediate access to any of this. It might appear that way because of thin privilege, but even the hot girl at the bar who gets all the male attention still will have to work on a healthy relationship. I think a good example of the nuance of thin privilege and that it is actually a thing and not in your head, but maybe not as much of a thing as you think, is from Virgie Tova's blog. Virgie is one of the nation's leading experts and lecturers on fat discrimination and body image. Virgie states on her blog that the idea that fatness is universally undesirable is also patently false and a delusion of fat phobia. There's also pretty good evidence that fat women have sex at similar rates to their thin counterparts, but are less likely to have meaningful romantic relationships than their thin counterparts because of stigma. This is important because what I'm trying to show is the nuance of weight and fighting food, and that often some of what we believe is partially true, but not the whole truth. So for example, she is saying it is harder for fat women to have meaningful romantic relationships because of the stigma of fatness. Now, I'm not an expert on fat phobia, so I'm not sure the way out of this. Is it understanding that marriage is also a patriarchal idea that keeps us isolated, right? It's like rooted in economic stability, not in this idea that we all need to meet one person and go, right off into the sunset. I'm not sure. And I know that weight loss alone won't give us the tools for a healthy relationship. And if we are building up our weight and not realizing the lines between something that makes life harder because of stigma and a complete golden ticket, we are also building up other areas of our lives where we feel vulnerability. Some ways this comes out in the health and wellness space. We think this doctor's appointment will give us the answer rather than more information we need to learn to synthesize. We think this way of eating is my answer rather than discern what works best for our bodies and addressing underlying causes and emotional healing. We think our binging, overeating, or depression is who we are rather than a symptom in our emotional and physical cries for help. We need to be able to recognize how we are building things up and making them a thing in the first place. I remember with my work with Bob, it was such a new way of healing that I was worried about doing it right, which was the obstacle in the path to realize there was no right or wrong. Anyways, I had to settle in for however long it was going to take, and trying to get it right was only adding unproductive pressure. Again, this was such a new way of being for me because I had always felt pressure or gearing up was necessary for success. It is sometimes and not always. Eventually, I surrendered, and it took me a while too. As they say in Taoism, go slow to go fast. I often see the overemphasis on diet and exercise for depression or things like endometriosis, pretty much all diagnoses. But the further we go on our healing path, the more we realize how much emotional health, and from my point of view, healing our story and trauma matters too. This is often hard to hear if you are in, say, a ton of physical pain from something like endometriosis. But often we can use food and exercise to alleviate enough of the physical pain that we can start to hear the more subtle, invisible emotional pain, or realize that if we are having trouble being consistent with what we know will make us feel good, our inconsistency is a symptom, then even more relief and freedom are available to us. Remember I said the deeper we root, the higher we rise? The more we work on their layers of healing, the more we realize how much healing is possible. And the more we heal, the more you get that this is the thing isn't a thing, and everything is a tool for you to access your own truth versus the answer. This can be disheartening, but it's also a relief to know that nothing is make or break or permanent. There's lots of room to experiment and play. And in the beginning, it doesn't feel like play. And if you stick with it long enough, you'll get there. The fourth thing is to know that there is enough to go around. What we all want most, belonging, freedom, and to express our truth, isn't scarce. There is enough to go around. Nature is elegant and often abundant. Often we don't even know what enough looks like for us, but we can often identify that at thinner weights, we weren't happy enough, or it didn't last long enough, or we still thought we needed to lose 10 more pounds to really be happy. Or a lot of clients look back when they felt fat, they realized they weren't, right? So if we go one level deeper, we often know what isn't enough, but not what is enough. And so the work is also to know what enough is. As I worked through my work with Bob, the little bit of on and off track and desire to lose weight was weeded out for good. I wasn't weighing myself at the time, and after about a year of our work, I went in for my physical, and my doctor told me I had gained 10 pounds that year. She also recommended that I lose it. And I remember for the first time in my life truly being like, this is what it is. I would eventually lose 5 of those pounds from actually eating more and becoming more active again and not exercising in the same way. That's the funny thing. But I think I kept 5 of those pounds on, and probably until I got pregnant, and I truly did not care. I remember feeling so much liberation that gaining those pounds did nothing to change how I showed up in the world. Again, that was a metric that I was like, this is worth it. To this day, I get weighed once a year at the doctor's, and that's how I know what I weigh. And of course, in pregnancy, they have you weigh yourself. And during that whole process, I didn't freak out about my body or really feel anything except awe that I was creating or 3D printing, as Elisa Vitti said in our fertility season, a human being. And I didn't take it for granted. I felt deep gratitude that I wasn't worried about gaining weight or how I would lose it. I knew I just could trust my body, and it enabled me to really enjoy the pregnancy experience so much more. And even this time postpartum, I know some people worry about getting their body back. I don't, maybe they have more emotional capacity than me, but I'm just trying to keep like the lights on with keeping Essa alive and myself alive and working. My point is, it's just not taking up any brain space. And I feel deeply like humbled and grateful that that is the case. I had more of myself back after working with Bob, and I truly got that my weight wasn't going to cost me in any way that mattered to me. And yes, I'm in a field that I'm sure people don't work with me because I don't have a six pack or that I'm not a size 4, or you look at how supermodels come out with a lifestyle plan and they have this huge following and people think that they have a secret plan. I get that that is thin privilege, and I don't want to be doing work that revolves around getting a six pack or losing weight to lose weight. I'm not wrong, and neither are the people doing that. At least that's how I see it. We can all choose to align with what we value. I love the work I do with clients. I love how they learn to integrate the parts of themselves and move forward to offer more integrative and powerful art, leadership, and parenting, right? So, this is what I hope you get, is that it's not good or bad. It's all about alignment and finding what's alignment for us. So in conclusion, to end food and life guilt, we have to grow into a researcher and true scientist who explores possibilities and is willing to challenge what we think is true. This way we can work through both the process and the cycles of being reborn. And true scientists know there will always be more questions, because the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. And to get comfortable with the unknown and know it can be full of nurturing possibility and healing instead of failure, rejection, criticism, and unbelonging is possible if how we can be is discerning, the moderate middle between naivete and judgment. Because when we are looking for most in weight loss or any healing is a sense of home in our bodies, they're our first homes to both weather and enjoy life in. And we can do that when we welcome back more of ourselves. So from an emotional standpoint, you want to take an experimental approach to food and life choices by first, not closing the story loop or judging yourself immediately, but rather over time. Second, giving yourself space and time to look at trends to examine why you ate what you ate or chose what you chose and know you can learn from it. The third is right-sizing what you did. You didn't fall off the balance beam. You discovered more of your story and can fall back to spring forward, and that it's all about learning more, each appointment, each food choice, etc. And remember that there is enough belonging, recognition, and freedom for all of us. And the more we have this in our lives, the more there is for us and everyone else. My favorite thing is when people get free and then they help others get free, right? From a food standpoint, keeping our blood sugar balanced going into eating sweet or salty indulgences is the key to being moderate. We can learn how to do this with our favorite treats by how and when to eat them, and by slowing down the judgment that today is an off day, rather than tuning in as we go to what we need. Remember, as a general rule of thumb, if you are genuinely hungry, you probably need more protein, usually animal protein, if you're parasympathetic or balanced on the autonomic nervous system. If you are tired, you probably need a complex carb like a sweet potato or fruit. And if you're craving salty or sweet, you needed more fat. How we are in our stories is what matters as much as the contents of our stories. How we are is often assuming we are under attack and that we need to judge, react, and build things up because there's a scarcity of safety or belonging and recognition. We assume we have to be defensive because the balance beam of being on with our food and life is a narrow definition of good and a wide array of what's bad. By evaluating based on our own metrics, responding, right-sizing, and remembering what is enough, and balancing our blood sugar that we have a clearer mind to make these choices, we can heal our ideas of good and bad and give ourselves more freedom to be who we truly are, which is never good or bad, but rather about finding the space and alignment where we can be safe to be authentic, and whatever that means for us. Thanks for tuning in. I'll be back next week with Sugar Rehab, our final episode of the season. For those of you who love sugar, this one will definitely be for you. Thank you, Health Rebels, for tuning in today. Have a reaction, question, or want the transcript from today's episode? Find me at alishapiro.com. I'd love if you leave a review on Apple Podcast and tell your friends and family about Insatiable. It helps us grow our community and share a new way of approaching health in our bodies. Thanks for engaging in a different kind of conversation. And remember, always, your body truths are unique, profound, real, and liberating.